Okay, welcome everyone. I'm here joined by Paul from the YouTube channel PFJung, and let's get right into it. Tell us about your name. Why is it called PFJung? What does that stand for?
Yes. Well, it sounds like PF Chang's, and PF Chang's a big Chinese restaurant in. I don't know if is it in Germany? Do you have PF Chang's in Germany?
I haven't
PF.
heard of it.
Okay, yeah, PF Chang's is a big Chinese restaurant, and this is a semi joke, but PF Chang, PF Jung sounds like PF Chang,
Hmm.
and I learned a while ago there's something called the grandmother neuron or the Jennifer Aniston neuron, which is
Oh yeah,
like it's basically uh there's reason to believe that we have specific neurons that are associated with specific concepts. So if PF Young sounds like PF Chang, I can just hijack onto that neuron that people already have, and I've got
right.
some immediate marketing potential. But that's just the real reason is PF for my initials, and then Jung, named after Carl Jung,
Right.
who I would say is the other than Jordan Peterson is the kind of philosopher, psychologist person that I've dug into the most myself, and I've always been a big fan of fiction and the archetypes in particular, and seeing how those manifest. So P.F. Jung was kind of the I didn't put that much thought into it, as you could tell. That's why I led with
Okay.
the P.F. Chang's thing first. It's probably not, the most philosophically accurate way of describing it, but
Well, it's
yes,
good. It's a
that's where the name comes
parasitic
from.
meme.
Exactly, exactly. Parasitize off of the PF chain,
Yeah,
PF
yeah.
chain neurons. Yeah,
Actually, I have a background in neuroscience. Like I'm currently studying neuroengineering, and my undergrad before that was physics. And for me personally, Jung is a kind of like an intellectual counterweight. So instead of
interesting.
focusing all on that mathematical aspect, the kind of computer science, engineering aspect, I got something to balance the uh, intellectual forces by reading Jung and looking
Right.
at stories and myths and these kind of things.
Sure.
And yeah, big fan of Jung here as well. And what I wanted to talk to you about was first of all, in general, online debates. Specifically, I've seen your debate with Vosh, who's like you could say famous in the political debating sphere. You could
Or
say,
infamous, but yes.
or infamous, whatever
Yeah.
you want to see. It depends on what political aisle you're from. I personally try and stay apolitical in my end. I'm trying to focus on technology and these kind of things. But I mean, debating it's an online sport, and I'd just like to know, how did it feel getting in there, getting into the cage?
Yeah, I was gonna have a panic attack. I thought I was about 4/5 of the way to having a panic attack. My heart was beating at probably 150 beats per minute or something, and you couldn't people couldn't tell, but I could tell on my camera because I think bigger on the screen, a little bit more HD from my end. I could see my
Right.
shirt like pumping up on my chest, just like ever
Vibrating.
so slightly.
Right.
And yeah, but I mean, I think there was like 8,000 people watching live, and it was just, I'd watched him for several years. So then seeing me next to him and him responding to like me was kind of a weird experience.
Right.
Um, but yeah, it's interesting you say, politics is like is like a sport pretty much, which, yes, in a lot of ways, people treat it like that. And I do to some degree, but I think what I try and do, and we were talking about just a little bit before we started recording, um, like in that debate, my goal was to go in and have a conversation and speak to the actual person, Vosh, right? Ian is his real name.
Right.
And a lot of people, they just come onto this space and they just play their online persona, right? And they just argue the points, and they don't make any attempt, it seems, to acknowledge that there's a real person here that is being motivated to argue and being motivated to debate, right? It's not just your idea versus my idea. It's I have reasons to disagree with you that I'd like to hash out with you, which is a
Right.
very different perspective. And in fact, I did a video following up on my debate with Vosh, and I didn't know this until afterwards. But when the stream ended on his side, he basically said to his audience, I really did enjoy talking to Paul because, you know, even though I disagree with him and he's obviously wrong, blah, 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 you know, he clearly is genuinely attached to his ideas. I believe the video he titled it on his channel is called Debate with Jordan Peterson Fan Gets Emotional, which is like, in my opinion, a little bit exaggerated. I mean, I definitely said like, hey, it pisses me off when you say things like all conservatives are equivalent to the KKK, because you're
Right.
basically implying that my conservative family members are the type of people who would go, you know, lynch black people, which is like
Right.
absurd intellectually, but also
Right.
just a complete asinine thing to say, like, to another human being. And so, you know, I made that clear. And I think my approach to the debates is to try to be as real as possible without getting necessarily stuck in the purely intellectual. But there's a
Yeah.
balance because, you know, as we, like I said, briefly talked about, it might have been better to have gotten more into just the arguments themselves rather than sort of the meta conversation around them. But,
Right. Right.
you know,
Right.
it's certainly a lesson learned on my part.
Yeah, well, I mean, I feel to some extent, it's it's kind of like, you know, when you listen to a particular music genre. I'm just taking that example because it's more neutral and less baggage involved in it.
Sure.
If you have a certain music genre you're into, then a music genre that's kind of far away from it, all the songs sound the same. You often hear that, you know, like, oh, I don't listen to rap. Rap just all sounds the
Sure.
same to me. I
Yeah,
don't listen to
classical
heavy.
all sounds the same.
It all
Sure.
sounds the same. Yeah, if it's not kind of your political aisle, you get the same thing there. I get the feeling where, let's simplify it radically. Say there's a triangle, and you have liberalism, nationalism, and socialism, for example. You have this triangle, and the one end of the triangle will always put the other two into kind of one basket. They're actually kind of colluding against me. You know, it's
Right.
kind of, you hear socialists often saying that liberals, you know, a lot of liberals are potential fascists. You know, it's like fascism, or like the theory is often that fascism is liberalism in decay. You often hear that. It's a common kind of characterization of what fascism is, that stems from the Frankfurt School. So you had members there of the so-called neo-Marxists that claimed that fascism is essentially liberalism in decay, and there is an argument to be made for that. There is an argument to be made that, you know, the when the free market fails and the current bourgeoisie elite class that's winning in the market is trying to secure its position by using state force, by using some sort of fascist imposition. And then, but you can spin that in every direction, right? That means you often hear libertarians saying that you know, socialism and fascism are the same because they're both state tyranny, right? Fascism is just socialism with some, you know, more nationalist characteristics or more racist characteristics, but they're basically, you know, potential collaborators anyways.
Yeah.
And you get then the same thing from, you know, nationalists or fascists or whatever you want to call them. They basically see liberals and socialists both as degenerates, or, you know, both as symptoms of modern decay of culture and tradition and race and nation, whatever.
Right. Yeah, it's horseshoe theory, and everyone is on the center end of their horseshoe, right?
Yeah. Everyone is the moderate, reasonable parts of this on the.
I know. I've made the joke. It's like everyone. This isn't true, but like in certain ways, or people don't say this is true, but I think in certain ways it is. It's like everyone believes themselves to be the golden mean, right? Because like if you're like a socialist, a very strong socialist, you still think full out communism is too far left, right? So that, like, if you can articulate who is too far left and who is too far right, then you are kind of by default saying I'm in the golden mean. That doesn't necessarily mean you're a centrist, but I've always thought of that, of just everyone thinks they're in the proper balance, whether they call it a centrist or not. So yeah.
One thing I noticed though about online debate culture is it's more like, that's why I said it's a sport. It's more about the technique than necessarily about the content of what you're saying, so, or what your beliefs are. I
Definitely.
feel like what you're trying to do is build up a very robust kind of system, a very robust system of your worldview that you can consistently defend in a debate. And people like Destiny or Vosh, Ian, are pretty good at this, I would say.
Yeah.
And I think you could see that, and I don't know if you perhaps didn't notice in the moment, but there was a point where Ian asked you something like, why do you think XY is evil? Why do you think, where does that come from? Why do you think that, right? And most normal people, you and me, whatever, we don't have a sort of logically consistent system spun out in our heads where we have like where we deduce every moral and ethical claim from first principles. It's mostly gut feeling. That's how you responded. You said,
Right.
it's gut feeling, and it feels bad when I think of fascism, whatever.
Yeah. I think I said something like, I get a funny feeling when I hear the word Nazi and I consider it evil. Yes, that was
Right.
exactly to your point. Yeah.
Right. And I think what he was getting at, and what's kind of, I think, made you look like on the lower end in this aspect, is that you didn't have a system to battle his system with, right? So he has certain first principles, and then he uses some sort of ethical or moral theory to defend those principles. In his case, I think it's some sort of rule utilitarianism. He starts with some moral anti-realist basis for his first principles of his morals or ethics, or whatever you want to call it, and then he derives all sorts of political claims and moral claims from it by using rule utilitarian ethics. So instead of looking at each particular situation, you look at whether, if that rule was applied, whether it leads to more happiness, to more, pleasure in the world or not.
Sure. I think he would.
Don't,
I don't know if he would describe himself that way. I think he's a strict consequentialist in that it's not based on the rules; it's based on the outcomes of each individual action. But he is a utilitarian in the broader regard that you're describing.
Yeah. So like I would say that like what he probably wanted you to come out with is with something akin to that. And I would say there's a spectrum between this Kantian global maxims that you have like principles that are universal and you should never break them, even if you'd save someone from the Nazis,
right.
by following it or by breaking it. And then you've got the like other end of the spectrum, which is like purely utilitarian. You look at every action, even something that someone would find reprehensible could in that particular case be good, and and then you try to, but I personally think in actual life, no one acts like that. I think in actual life, it's always contradictory, and you act upon many different cultural values, personal values, circumstances, situations. You can't really do that. But in the case of an online debate on politics and discussing policy, then I think he kind of expected something like that to then try and tear down, which you didn't come prepared with that.
Yes. Well, so this is I agree with your criticism because I did come prepared for that debate. Moral realism versus moral anti-realism. I've done probably 3 or 4 videos drilling down kind of what is objective morality, how do we derive objective morality. Vosh's moral system is basically, if we can agree on a random, or if we can all agree on a set of axioms, then we can use logic to build on top of that and determine what's good or not, right? And his axiom is essentially, I want to do the least amount of harm, right? He's basically a utilitarian in any normal person's view, to the degree that the normal person even has words for utilitarianism and all that stuff. But so 2 things. The reason I didn't go into that and didn't address that directly was because, again, the game that I was playing, I don't mean game like deceptively, but the thing that I was trying to do was I was trying to have a conversation with the person. And your point about the average person not even necessarily having the language to even begin to have that debate, let alone actually do the debate in the system versus system. I purposely kind of went around the question to say, look, I know we can have this conversation about where we derive the definition of evil, but you and I are going to agree, no matter what system we have, that the Nazis were evil. So let's
Right.
just start there and have the more important conversation about, do you understand why now calling all conservatives Nazis is a bad thing? That was a conversation I was more interested in having. But
Right.
there's a legitimate conversation and an intellectually more interesting one that is moral realism versus moral anti-realism. And to the degree that I have an objective moral system, or to the degree that anyone can have one, I basically agree with Vosh in that if we can agree, and I think this is just my understanding of the general issue with moral philosophy is you have to brute force certain assumptions, no matter what you do. Right? There's
Right.
certain things there's certain axioms you have to start with. You call it faith, you call it self-evident, whatever. You start with your axioms, and then using logic, you can make moral claims built on top of that, right? So if we agree that, improving people's lives is good, or improving people's health or their mental health or their well-being in the Sam Harris way is good, then we can come up with objective answers to those questions. But the
Right.
axioms themselves are not necessarily objective, right? Like the Nazis being bad is not like some law of physics, right?
Yeah.
My belief, and this is, again, I take a lot of influence from Peterson is human beings evolved the capacity for morality in order to compete or cooperate in social games, right? We're social animals, and so we have these rules that govern our behavior. Morality is all about, action in the context of other people. If there were no other people, then morality wouldn't really exist, right? If you're the only person here, morality would be an irrelevant concept. So morality is about the actions or the principles that govern the actions in between, amongst people. And human beings evolve the capacity to play games. And the capacity for play, which is something that all animals or most social animals engage in, dogs, rats. There's like a Jordan Peterson meme about rats wrestling. It says rats wrestle, and that's proof that I
Okay.
think that the statement is if two rats can be two rats can be let into like a pen.
Yeah.
They're in their little houses or whatever, their little chambers, and then they go into a central area to play. A big rat will always beat a little rat, but the big rat has to let the little rat win something like 30% of the time in
Okay.
order for the little rat to even be willing to come out to play. And
Okay.
Peterson's claim is, oh my God, that's a Nobel Prize winning observation, because it implies that the ethic of fair play is built into social animals. And I
Mhm.
think our objective I think the axioms that we come to agreement on are not arbitrarily chosen, which is what Vosh would say. We arbitrarily choose our axioms and then we build it up from there. I think those axioms, we are hardwired to respond to those axioms, or hardwired to have those axioms, because due to our innate capacity for play, which emerged out of, our animals engaging in play behavior to mature their brains and all that, and learn to cooperate with each other. So I know that was a ton of ranting.
Well, they don't necessarily need to be contradictory. Like they can be hardwired to some extent and then kind of express themselves differently depending on the environment. Like in a modern
Definitely.
society, different environments, you'll have a different kind of expression of the kind of social play you're engaged in. And
Yes, but the nature, so each individual game can be different, but the
yep.
meta game is the same, right? So it's like every language is going to be different and particularized to each environment, but the structure of the language is still universal, if that makes sense.
Yes, and I think that's a good transition to the next thing I wanted to talk about, and that is postmodernism. So it is this that is actually the important question, whether there is such a thing as the meta myth, the meta
Right.
game, the overarching kind of central observer, you could call it. And that is kind of a big question I've been thinking about, and I think it's the big question surrounding the whole debate over people like Peterson. I'm personally friends with a guy called Hans-Georg Möller. He's got a YouTube channel on philosophy called Carefree Wandering.
Oh yes, yes,
You
I'm
know,
familiar. You're
I
friends with
got
him, or you're in contact with him, or
I have two videos with him, one on ChatGPT. I could
wow, okay,
I could forward it to you, and
yeah, definitely, I'd love to see that.
I've written a review of his book, and I'm in contact with him from now
Wow.
and then.
Okay. Man, I'd
Yeah,
love to talk to Mr. Is it Muller, right? Huh? Or
yeah, Miller. Yeah.
yes, he is. Yes. Oh, he's got some interesting critiques of Jordan Peterson.
He
Yeah,
has so far
okay.
my favorite ones. My favorite ones.
Okay, right on. Okay, cool,
My
cool.
are the critiques by Möller, and I
Sure.
do like my debates with Möller, and I've, like I said, I've written a whole critical review of his book and his basic philosophy there, which is the origin of his whole critique of Peterson.
Right. Okay. Awesome.
And essentially, the idea is that, Möller, he rejects a central observer. He rejects this sort of, there's this overarching meta myth, meta narrative, whatever. And he says that this sort of postmodernist turn is just one of a series of disappointments, not in a judgmental way, but it's like, you get the disappointment of humans not being at the center of the universe anymore. Then with Darwin, the disappointment that humans are not the peak of nature anymore. With Freud, that humans are not purely, reasonable and rational anymore.
Right.
And then the fourth one is that, like, humans are not even individuals anymore, right? Humans are, it's this Marxist, modernist, or whatever postmodern neo-Marxist, let's use that term.
Yeah.
Turn. And this idea that, like, even looking at humans at the level of individual perhaps has failed us in a sense. And this postmodernism needs to be seen from a way broader lens than has been done so far by people like Peterson. And I would agree with that to an extent, because it is like, it's a movement in art, it's a movement in theater, it's not just a purely philosophical thing, and it's also not just Marxist. Like, one of the first postmodernists is said to have been Nietzsche, right? And I would say Nietzsche is very much not exclusively a philosopher of the left, right? And also Heidegger, who was a member of the Nazi party, right? So there's a lot of controversy on that, but Heidegger's often been characterized also as the first postmodernist. And
Interesting.
his student being Derrida, beginning the whole deconstruction thing. And the idea, I think, is just the rejection, or not just the rejection, the acknowledgement of the failure of a sort of overarching metaphysic that you had in academic philosophy, first of all, through scholastic theology, kind of Christian dogma that was at the center of philosophy. And then the attempts of idealist philosophers from Kant to Hegel to kind of maintain some sort of supremacy of reason or supremacy of the spirit, to which all the sciences attach to, which renders philosophy as a sort of queen of the sciences that all the other disciplines attach to. And it's kind of acknowledgement that all of these pursuits have failed. All of these pursuits have failed, and we are left with kind of an emptiness there. And what has happened instead is that the lines between philosophy that attempts to be, let's say, academic and scientific, and that philosophy which is more poetic and artistic, that these lines have been blurred. And then you get these works of, what you then call these French postmodernists, where you have Foucault and Deleuze and Baudrillard, which are kind of blurry
Poetic.
kind of blurry in a sense. I mean, Baudrillard, for example, I personally love. Like, he's inspired the works of the movies The Matrix. I don't know if you're familiar with Baudrillard. He's written Simulacra and Simulation.
Yes. I have a copy that my friend gave me that I couldn't. It was very difficult to get through the first couple pages. It was like reading Nietzsche. I'm like, I'm not smart enough to understand most of this.
Oh, it's awful to read. I get that. I get that.
Yeah.
But what I'm trying to get at is that, like, there is an interesting critique that Möller makes, and that is, what if what you're seeing in universities, and Möller critiques it just as Peterson does. Möller is just as much of a critic as Peterson is. What if what you're seeing is not postmodern neo-Marxism, it's actually postmodern neo-capitalism? You know what I mean? It's like, what you see, none of them have actually read Marx anymore. None of them actually seriously promote Lenin or Stalin or Marx or any of that anymore. None of them adhere to any dogma anymore. It's actually something very fluid. It's almost like let's say, McDonald's ideology. You know what I mean? It's like, it's very fashion-based, very fluid, it changes all the time, and very opportunistic. You could almost say the fact that it has no dogma perhaps makes it postmodernist, but it's actually just there to maintain the university as an institution to generate revenue, right?
I'm taking notes, by the way. So if you hear me typing, that's I want to
yeah.
make sure I don't forget anything that you're talking about.
Yeah, don't worry. And and I thought that was an interesting point. When I talked to Möller in person, or not in person, but outside of a recording in private, kind of, he said that he personally doesn't even have a problem that much with this term postmodern neo-Marxist, because in a lot of ways, the current dogmas, you can trace them back to the Frankfurt School, to like Adorno, Horkheimer, Marcuse. I think specifically late Frankfurt School, late critical theory, Herbert Marcuse. I recommend you to read it just out of curiosity, because you can find, it's written in the 70s, 80s, and you can find a lot of today's dogmas of, let's say, postmodern neo-Marxist, woke, whatever, intellectual dogma. You can find it there explained with Freudian theory, right? It's very much Freud mixed with a kind of neo-Marxism applied to societal dynamics, and it talks about all these things such as, you know, structural oppression, institutionalized patriarchy. All of these terms are in there, so he doesn't have a problem with that. But he claims that they don't actually take these works seriously. You know, they happen to right now draw from works of critical theory, but they may just throw them in the trash tomorrow and choose someone else to quote. You know what I mean?
Right.
So that's the kind of idea. I'd let you get in there now.
Sure. Well, man, there's a bunch of stuff. I just realized we should probably have several more hour-long conversations that are specific to each topic, because I think this would be incredibly interesting.
Probably.
So let's see. Okay, so the part about them not taking it seriously, right? They say that they're this, but they don't actually engage with Marx or whatnot. So I have a minor in gender studies. And so I kind of saw firsthand the most extreme, at least a glimpse of kind of the think tanks of the progressive left, right? The far left, right? Like, you know, if the Heritage Foundation or the Ayn Rand Institute is the think tanks for libertarians, then gender studies departments are the think tanks for, you know, the woke or the postmodern Marxism, however you want to characterize it. And we absolutely studied and, what would you say, accepted as true the ideas of people like Foucault. Judith Butler is a key postmodern figure, genders of performance, genders of social, everything's a social construct kind of idea. That was clearly there. And at the same time, just as much, and I actually have the PDF I downloaded from the Canvas website, like my school portal, like where I submit all my assignments. I downloaded the syllabus and some of the the documents we read, and a lot of it was Marxist as well. So the Combahee River Collective, for example, says explicitly we are Marxist and whatnot. And so the thing I wrote down is, you said it's fluid, right? It's like a McDonald's, like the dot, like they like it today, but they can throw it out tomorrow.
Right.
The rationalizations are fluid, right? And it's interesting because if you are truly a postmodernist, whatever that means, then in principle, logical consistency is not that relevant, right? Or it's at least it's not of a higher order moral principle than anything else, because the claim that logical consistency is important would be sort of a meta narrative in and of itself, right? Or at least a meta moral system.
Yeah, I guess it would be more something of analytical philosophy, that they have very much a focus on logical consistency, whereas continental philosophy, if that's a fair distinction, continental philosophy is equated to postmodernism. It's more an artistic performance, you could say.
The aesthetic side.
Yeah. But I mean, it has, in my view, generated some very interesting works. Like personally, I like Deleuze's work, you know, I don't know if you're familiar with anti-Oedipus, Capitalism and Schizophrenia. It's like the French insane Jung in a way. So
nice. Like, if Jung wasn't crazy enough.
Like Zizek has once characterized Deleuze to be to Lacan, the French big
psychoanalyst,
what Jung was to Freud, in a sense. So
Interesting. Okay.
So Freud and Lacan are the big kind of that build these structural theories, and then Jung and Deleuze are those that are kind of these artists that kind of
Yeah, sure. Right.
explore much deeper than
Archetypes
that.
and all. Yes, right. Well, the reason I bring that up is because the the rationalizations, I do think what they profess to believe changes, and they'll be postmodernist when it suits them, and then they'll be Marxist when it suits them, which is funny because that's exactly how, for example, Vosch operates. Vosch bases his moral injunctions from a Marxist framework, like very clearly, but then he claims to be a postmodernist. So it's like, well, why is alienation of labor in and of itself bad, unless if you're really a moral anti-realist? But
Can I interject?
Go ahead.
Can I interject? Sorry. I think personally it's a misconception that Marxism is necessarily moralist. I've read a very compelling book by a former professor of mine called Moral Nihilism, and it goes through historical philosophies of moral nihilism, and he identifies the biggest and first moral nihilist of the Enlightenment era to be Karl Marx. Karl Marx explicitly does not speak of good and evil, but he speaks of material necessities. So there is a sort of historical process of what's called production and the means of production, which are overthrown through material processes, through a material dialectic. And that is described as if it's a force of nature, right? It's not
right. It's not prescriptive. It's a description of just how reality and society works, right?
So gravity is not bad or good,
right.
And in the same way, the revolution of the productive forces is also not good or bad. It is necessity. So the productive forces necessarily are overthrown by the force of history. Now, sorry, you can continue now.
Yeah, well, okay. So that's interesting because, and I think this characterizes maybe certainly a fundamental perspective in my worldview. And I don't know to what degree I'd be curious to hear your thoughts once I kind of explain it. Because earlier we were talking about Vosch, the debate, and how, my perspective is I want to go into that basically speaking as if someone who has no philosophical background is listening, and they're just a regular person in their day-to-day life that doesn't even know what consequentialism is or anything like that, right? I don't. It is fundamental to my worldview that every idea or every rationalization, again, cannot be analyzed independent of the people professing those ideas. I think there's exception with like physics or math, right? Because obviously you can be a psychopath, and if you write out a physics equation, it's going to be true or false in the same way that anyone else would. But when you're putting forward like a political idea or a philosophical idea, I think William James talked about philosophical temperaments. It's like all ideas are extensions of our fundamental motivations and personalities.
Right.
And so why did I bring that up? I bring that up because when it goes to like the postmodernists and the Marxists and stuff, it's like, well, postmodernism is skeptical of narratives, but Marxism is a narrative. So there's a contradiction there. So it's not necessarily a useful way to think about it. And it's like, the more important thing is that with postmodern neo-Marxism, it's the fact that it's contradictory is the key idea, because it allows someone to be postmodernist when it suits their motivations. Gender is a social construct. Morality is created by human beings, and we should be able to deconstruct it however we want. So that we can critique through postmodernism, but then we can offer injunctions through Marxism. And it's contradictory, and it allows one to switch out whenever, because it's a series of rationalizations that allow one to act out their motivations, which I believe is what all philosophy is, right? And so, like you said about the universities, it's just designed to, in many ways, maintain postmodern we say neo-capitalism or something like that, postmodern.
I just made that up. I am not.
Yeah,
well,
but that's it. But think about it, because all of the professors get paid based off of their students borrowing loans, to pay for tuition.
Yeah,
and who takes on the risk for those loans? The federal government. So the banks loan all this money out, and then they reap all of the interest. And if they, if they don't get or if the federal loans don't get paid, then it's the taxpayer who's on the hook, right? And it's like that is literally the most corrupt capitalist possible system you could come up with. That's what happened in the housing crisis. People who it was, hey, even though you have no credit rating to be able to afford $1 million house, the government is going to backstop these loans. So we'll loan this out to you anyway because the government will insure us if it goes backwards. That's exactly what's happening with student loans. Oh, you're going to get a degree, and you're going to take out $100,000 of debt when you're 18 years old for, a degree that doesn't have any immediate application in returning that money. Well, we'll do that because the government's just going to back it up and the taxpayer will bail you out. That is pure capitalist garbage right there in people's face. And the fact that those professors operate in that environment but don't seem to acknowledge, like, hey, your entire job is a critique of capitalism, and yet you are the one perpetuating the very system that you're claiming to critique, right? So it's a contradiction, and it's just about motivation. It's not like objectively true in the rationalizations.
Yes, I mean, I think that's exactly where I think Peterson misses the mark in a sense. It's like he's right in seeing that like these ideologies, they're there to foster compliance in a sense instead of actually educate, but they don't foster compliance with some sort of shadow communist party that wants to take power, right? It's compliance with this entire machinery to keep generating, keep sucking money out of the system, it's keep generating this revenue. And so you're fighting windmills. You can't actually come and then in the free marketplace of ideas show that there are contradictions, and then they're gonna
exactly
be defeated and retreat, and it doesn't work. It doesn't work.
Right.
I guess he's realizing it, but he's realizing it with a lot of frustration, and the thing is,
although I would push back just a little bit against because he has specifically stated, it's not a cabal of these postmodern neo-Marxists, whatever that means, getting together and saying, here are our plans to take over the culture, right? I mean, there are some small minority of individuals who literally talk about subversion of culture and different things in like a Gramscian sense, right? That was literally kind of the central claim of Antonio Gramsci. Mm-hmm. But the example he always uses is, the average Marxist, the average person who calls themselves Marxist, chances are they probably never even read Marx, right? It's like a Christian. Mm-hmm. Most Christians, or people who claim to be Christians, have never read the Bible.
Yeah,
right. And most Marxists probably wouldn't know what historical materialism or dialectical materialism is, right?
Yeah.
But if you get enough, so like each person who's a Marxist or each person who's a Christian is really only 10%, right? Like at any given time, I'm only 10% Marxist, 10% Christian. But if you get enough people in the room together, and they all have a little bit of the ideology, then as a group, they begin to act out the totality of that ideology. And that's not like a top-down conscious conspiracy, but that's, hey, we all have a kind of an idea of what this belief system is. And when we get together, we kind of bounce and echo, and kind of, it's a positive feedback loop until we actually recreate the whole idea. And that's much less conspiratorial in the classic sense than what I think people believe Peterson is saying. If that
but
makes sense.
There's no whole idea. That's the problem. There's no whole idea. Like in let's say when the Soviet Union was still around, there was a whole idea you could point to. At least you could characterize it pretty well. And that is the whole kind of, let's say, dissatisfaction a lot of people had with his debates with Zizek, for example, where he just kind of argued against this alleged straw man overarching Marxist idea that's just not represented anymore anywhere. And that is the whole thing. If you argue against postmodernism, that's why I'm saying you're fighting windmills, because there is no overarching, there's no puzzle that you put together, and then there is some sort of, now you see the full picture of what the ideology is. I would argue there is no actual core. It is actually just pure kind of production. It's almost you can almost understand it best from a Marxist view. It's basically like, you could call the education or the university the education industry that just reproduces ideological jargon.
Well, so yes, I agree with that, but I do think you're right. There is no core, there's no whole idea, and that it's a complete coherent set of ideas. But there's enough of an idea there that is functionally relevant. So, for example, like the idea, for example, this is a relevant issue I talk about often. It's like, okay, we have children who are undergoing gender surgery because it's, the belief is male and female are socially constructed categories, and that's not just true for adults, that's true for children. So therefore, if they want to transition, that should be allowed. I if you press that logic, if you press the philosophy underlying that statement hard enough, you will, to your point, it's not a whole idea. There's internal contradictions. It doesn't make complete sense.
Right.
People would debate that, but I believe that's the case. But there's
Mhm.
enough of an idea there that is cohesive enough to drive that statement. Children should be allowed to transition. That is functionally relevant. And so
Right.
that's where I think the issue is, right? It's not that it's not completely cohesive. It's that it's cohesive enough in a negative way. And that's where I think the criticism is warranted.
Yes, I see your point. Um, the thing I would say to that is, however, it's the dynamic has changed, that you're not really fighting an idea that is kind of that you can fight on the same level as you'd fight any ideology of that sort. So, for example, I would characterize it as a whole as something like, you could say it's a subsection of transhumanism, and I don't mean just purely like my degree is
That's a great way to put it.
neuroengineering.
Yes,
I mean,
transhumanism. We should definitely talk about that at some point. Yes.
I mean, my degree is neuroengineering, and I
Right.
basically started studying it because I was terrified of it. Right. That's
Yeah. Okay. Good.
right.
Good. We're on the same page here.
So the idea that the full-on technological reproducibility of the human and the reduction of the human soul to mere functionality. And the interesting thing is, great authors that you could read that critique this are Frankfurt School authors. Read The One-Dimensional Man by Herbert Marcuse, or The Dialectics of Enlightenment by Adorno. These are the postmodern, maybe not postmodern, they're not postmodern, but these are the neo-Marxists, these neo-Marxists, and they've written very good stuff critiquing this kind of development on like they reduce it to the terms of behaviorism and operationalism, that the human is kind of reduced to a behaviorist, operationalist, kind of functional entity. It's kind of the technical rationality of capital, as they call it.
Yeah.
And what you have is everything becomes a configuration, a contingent configuration. You can change, like, gender can be switched on and off. You can change any configuration to whatever it is. And I don't even want to make a value judgment on the principle itself, but if everything becomes contingent, right, then you have a mental imbalance, because like you have, in philosophical dialectical thought, you always have to take into account the other side. What is necessary. If everything is contingent, where is the necessity left? And you can argue this. However, the technological rationality is not something we argue. It's not something we kind of decide to use. It just kind of festers. It spreads. We start adopting these technologies, and the technologies kind of develop and accelerate. And the kind of rejection of it, the kind of attempt to move away from this, I have the feeling, is much deeper than a dispute between academics. It's much deeper.
The attempt to move away from the transhumanist kind of ethos,
for example. Yeah, if you want to call it the transhumanist, like it's much deeper than an academic disagreement. You know what I mean? It's much deeper than that.
Yes. First off, I would say everything that I'm concerned with about these ideas and these discussions is always deeper than the mere academic disagreement. I don't believe really there's such a thing as a mere academic disagreement, other than like what we're talking about with the aesthetic philosophy. Like, well, does the way I phrase this idea sound better than the way I phrase it? Whatever. All of this, again, I ultimately bring it back to, I'm a real person here, living my day-to-day life. How do these ideas impact my life? How do they impact people around us? The transhumanist thing, 100% to your point, a potential offshoot of that would be like, the gender ideology question, but reducing consciousness to like a computation that you could upload into a computer. I've also been very interested and fearful of AI. In fact, there was like a 2-week period when ChatGPT came out, and DALL-E and all these image generators, where I was like, I've just wasted every single hour of my life making videos about all these like gender questions and stuff, because it's completely irrelevant now, because now AI is the single most important thing that's happened to civilization, which I think probably is the case. You would know far better in terms of how far we are off from artificial general intelligence and all that. But even just the ability to create synthetic reality, right? Where so much of our opinions and values are derived from a screen. If I can create synthetic reality to make it seem like I'm watching a video of someone saying something as if they actually said it in real life, when it's just a complete AI image, I can now create a synthetic reality that is conducive to a worldview that is otherwise untenable in real life, right? Whether that's whatever, the most extreme forms of Marxism or the most extreme forms of white nationalism, or however you want to characterize it, right?
Right.
And so that just came to my mind. I don't know, we're bringing up the transhumanist thing. First off, because I want to actually want to ask you about a different topic, but is there a thread that you want to pull through on this one, or is there something you want to?
No, feel free to
Okay.
feel free to bring in what you want.
Yeah, because it's kind of a divergence, because I work in an industry where I have been trying to use ChatGPT for programming. So I have a very limited code background, and I have a more like business operations background where I'm not coding software, but I'm using the software in Microsoft Excel, right? I would assume. Right. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So all of my coding is kind of in the VBA side of Excel. And I've been using ChatGPT to write out automated Excel macros, which would enhance productivity for businesses. And the whole idea of what degree now is AI going to replace the average person, whatever, and what implications does it have for the economy and society as a whole? Going back to the Marxist kind of critique of capitalism, I want to do an extended video on. You're familiar with Eric Weinstein?
Yes.
Yeah, he has this idea called the embedded growth obligation. Daniel Schmachtenberger is another guy who's kind of operating in this space, which is basically a Marxist critique of capitalism. Basically, the stock market and the economy as we know it assumes that the market will always be growing, assumes that a company can always increase its bottom line because there's a market that's growing along with it. But as the population starts to decrease, which it looks to be plateauing out, and certainly in the long run, it will probably end up declining. Those beliefs are unsustainable. And when you have something like AI that is going to take our capacity for innovation and 10x it and 100x it, right? Because the whole idea of, well, capitalism is a good system because it fosters innovation. It's like, okay, well, now if there's one thing we're not going to be in short need of anymore, it's innovation, because all of the problems that we weren't able to address with AI can now be addressed and all that. It's basically causing our entire view of capitalism to have to change. And the Marxist critique, I think there's a lot that you can draw from a Marxist critique that is valid. And the degree that I think Peterson is a bit of a boomer in that regard is he's still caught up in the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is like a legitimate thing. And, Marxism has caused a lot of problems. Like, no one disputes that.
But so is Christianity.
So is Christian. Exactly. So
that's the thing. He's silent often about the atrocities committed by the church and all these things. And it's like, yeah, I mean, you can try and separate and say religions are more holistic than ideologies. However, you got to be honest. You can't just say, okay, you've got all these people killed by Stalin, and that's in the basket of due to Marxism, due to Karl Marx ideas. And then you've got all these people killed in the name of Jesus. But that's somehow separate.
That's somehow right.
Exactly. That's separate from Christianity, right?
Right. So if Peterson, I think it's just hardwired into him at this point because he spent his whole life defending religion. Because there were so many people criticizing religion that he felt, I'm going to be the defender of religion.
Yeah.
And now it's kind of with Marxism, it's like, well, there's so many people who criticize Marxism. There needs to be people who like defend the valid aspects of it. Because to your point, I think you can absolutely draw valuable insights from Marxism and Christianity, like alienation of labor. It's like, I know this is not exactly how Marx phrased it, but like the idea that we all work from home because of COVID now, and we don't ever actually meet our coworkers, or I'll be working for a company and I never actually come in contact with anything that company actually does. Like, to me, that's a perfect example of what Marx was saying. The craftsman is alienated from his labor. I don't see the chair that I produce. Right.
Right.
It's exactly the same idea. It's like to say that is not a spot on critique is foolish, in my opinion. And so Peterson needs to, keep that his constant bitching about Marxism, which again is warranted to some degree with qualifications, I think blinds him to the legitimate critiques that he should be levying against capitalism. And he calls himself, I'm an evil capitalist and I make no bones about it. It's like, okay, sure, but like, at what point does your joke bleed into reality where you're working with the Daily Wire?
Yeah.
Who I can't stand some of these people on the Daily Wire. And the video I just released 30 minutes ago is all about how the things that people are saying on the Daily Wire are at direct odds with the moral philosophy that Jordan Peterson professes in his lectures. So what's he going to do about that, right?
And no offense, a lot of it is also very North American. Like the kind of idea that conservatism needs to defend capitalism no matter what is a very American thing. That is not,
and I'd say it's a libertarian thing in particular.
Libertarian thing, and it's like it's taken over the whole political discourse. It is not something that is taken for granted in Europe. Like, it really isn't. If you look at the conservative right-wing parties or whatever in most countries in Europe, there is no, I mean, not to some extent you do have it, especially because America is such an influential force, but you don't have it to that extent that conservatism necessarily needs to defend capitalism at any cost. Like, that's certainly not the case.
And it's so funny because it's like, well, Christianity is all about rejecting material wealth, right? Like, store up your treasures in heaven where moth and rust won't destroy. It's like the anti-consumerist ethic, which I think is valuable. Capitalism, I think there's a useful distinction between capitalism and consumerism that would, I think, open up space for middle ground between conservatives and Marxists or whatever you want to categorize it. But to your point, it's like, the whole free market. The joke thing I say is the only person dumber than a socialist is libertarian, right? If you want to abolish private property, that's almost as dumb as saying you want to abolish the government. It's like, it's just, these are simple one-dimensional answers to complex problems. And
they're fantasy realms. You're not gonna have a political platform to enforce this in any way, right?
Right. And that goes back to the point about like online debates. I debated the libertarians a couple times, and I'm just like, in the middle of the debate, they were saying things, we don't need government and stuff, or something absurd. And I thought to myself in the debate, this is a waste of my own time here, because I'm not going to convince anyone with logic here, because the logic just exists in this, liminal online space that can never be tested in reality. Right. So why do I'm not going to engage with an idea that doesn't have any doesn't have any application in reality. And the best way to prove an idea wrong, again, it's not just an academic discussion, is to put that idea into practice and then let those results speak for themselves. And I think that concept is more or less what I would call charisma, or like leading by example, where like, who do you have more respect for? The person who has researched a lot of these ideas about how to be a good person in morality, or the person that has done that and put that into application and demonstrated its proof, right? And so that's way more important. And again, going back to the very beginning, what I try to keep in mind when I'm going into those debates, where we can just have this purely intellectual discussion about moral realism, moral anti-realism, but how does this going to translate to the average person? We can get into this very kind of intellectual argument. It's interesting, but the more important thing that I was there for was, Vosh, you understand that your interpretation of this intellectual argument is absurd for these reasons, right? In a practical sense.
Right.
So
yeah, I mean, I get your point definitely. That like, you know, your average Joe, let's say, has to then, according to you're kind of showing that according to their own principles, your average Joe would have to see that he himself and his parents and his cousins, they're all fascists,
exactly,
you know,
or
and
Nazis, worse, like
or
KKK.
Nazis,
Yeah,
KKK members, Nazis were, and like in actual life and actual practice, they differ very little from, you know, your Californian. Do you live in California?
Dallas, Texas.
Dallas, Texas. Oh, okay.
I
Yeah,
just moved from Chicago.
you moved from Chicago. All right. Well, like I mean, the average liberal, like they probably watch the same Netflix shows. They
Oh,
probably
of
have
course.
the same kind of job,
Yeah,
IT
they
somewhere.
do work together. They go to the same churches, or they go to the same, sports games and stuff. Oh yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and then like their actual difference will be kind of in today's age will be kind of marginal because, like as you said, consumerism has actually made us all way more similar than we think. Like we all watch the same stuff on Netflix. Like it's like
Right.
made us way more similar. And it's just the difference is now like it's just this kind of let's say impotent mass of people that have no actual influence on politics, but they see politics going in a bad direction, which leads to this kind of political polarization. And then you get these kind of intense election campaigns and all these
Right.
things.
Well,
But you don't even know at this, we have no benchmark. We don't even know. Maybe comparably, this is nothing. Like historically speaking, people have been way more radical. People have been way more
oh yeah.
violent.
My my parents were just visiting. My dad's 67, 68, so he grew up during the race riots and the Vietnam War protests in America.
Right, right.
And like the multiple assassinations, Martin Luther King, John F. Kennedy, compared to now, it's like, we've obviously had significant bouts of violence. Although I believe, like, for example, the Black Lives Matter riots and the January 6th riot, those were certainly, with all of technology and all the cameras, different angles we had on all of that, it looks to be very extreme. And obviously it was in some degree, but I don't think it was anything from an absolute perspective caused by the riots like in the 70s and during the Vietnam War and stuff. And, I don't know when the last major political figure was assassinated. And so, like, yeah, we've definitely gone through some rough times, and it's not obvious if now is worse or we just have a clearer window into it with our phones, right? And who
Yeah.
knows how that shapes discourse and everything.
I mean, I read somewhere that during the World War or in the beginning of the World War, the American Fascist Party had several, I forgot the exact number, several 100,000 members, like up to 400,000 members. And
Really?
if you applied it, relatively speaking, percentage wise to today's population, that would mean the American Fascist Party would have to have like 3 million members or something like that. Like, relative to the population growth,
Yeah,
two
yeah, yeah.
million, something like that is unimaginable. There's no like
This
unimaginable. You
was
could never
prior to
imagine.
World War II or during?
I think in the prior and in the very beginning, as far
Yeah,
as I
okay. And then
know,
people were like, yeah, we
fighting the
can't have
fascists
this.
abroad also led to an internal political, let's
Right.
say, propaganda cleansing. You had to kind of internally kind of convince people that your enemy is
Yeah.
bad, So
Yeah, right.
so yeah, I think then towards the end of the World War, then that was kind of over. But like there was a lot of affinity. Like the as far as I know, the propaganda minister of Germany, Joseph Goebbels, he spoke very fondly of Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal and all the government programs that the
Sure.
Americans introduced to counteract wild free market excesses. And there's a lot of praise in Germany for that, for example. So
Yeah. Well, wasn't Bismarck the first like large scale? Didn't he? Otto von Bismarck implemented the first large scale social programs in, was it
right,
late 18th
right,
century or early
right,
19th century or late 19th century?
yeah, late 19th century, and
Yeah. So that was a German tradition, basically.
yes, yeah. Well, that's what I'm saying, and especially in Germany, that's a good example. Especially in Germany, the conservative tradition is very socialist, like socialist not in
Yeah.
the
Right.
Marxist sense, but socialist as in the top-down social program.
And it's interesting because conservative morality, I don't know if you're familiar with Jonathan Haidt. This is kind of his perspective. He's a
I
moral
heard of him, yeah.
psychologist. Yeah. And I think this is correct. Conservative morality is actually what we would consider normal conservative taboos or conservative moral injunctions are actually communitarian in their ethos. So, for example, like the idea that you should go out and get a job and be a productive member of society. That's kind of a communitarian, like it's coming from a place of you need to do what's good for the community, right? You need to go
Yes.
out and have kids and start a family for the benefit of the community versus the radical libertarian perspective, which is I think more left wing, in a moral sense of like what I want to do, I should be free to do, and I should be able to live my life by my own rules, and society's moral rules are oppressive and all that. It's like that's actually the very hyper individualistic perspective, and we have this notion hyper individualism is associated with conservatism, which economically I think makes sense from the capitalist perspective, but morally it's flipped, and so that makes sense. The German socialist tradition would line up with conservative modern conservatism, which I agree with. That makes sense from a moral perspective.
Yeah, I mean, the most conservative party that manages to get into governments here is the ruling party of Bavaria, which is the Christian Social Union. So
really interesting.
Yeah.
Wasn't who was your last Angela Merkel? Wasn't it Christian Democrats? Wasn't that her party or
Christian
something?
Democrat. Yeah, they are.
Right. I never knew that. I found that out like a year ago. I'm like, oh, that's kind of interesting. I thought the Europeans were a bunch of, atheist, godless heathens, according to Fox News.
Well, it's our conservative party, you could say, and it's like it's tied up with the Bavarian branch, which is called the Christian Social Union.
I see. Okay, got it.
So her party is the Christian Democratic Union. The party in Bavaria is the Christian Social Union, and they kind of go together as one pack and in the elections.
Right.
Yeah, but the political landscape differs quite a bit. I think very few countries have an equivalent to the American Republican Party. From my outsider view, I could neatly fit every party that we have in parliament. I could neatly fit them into the Democrats, with the exception of the AfD, the Alternative for Germany. I don't know if you've heard of them. They're
the far right one.
They're the right populist one, and maybe the socialist, the left. They're literally called Die Linke, the left. I don't know if you could find some corner in the Democrats in America for them.
Right.
Yeah, so I'd say, but the bulk of the parties in Germany, you could neatly fit them into the Democrats. Even the Christian Democrats, who are the conservatives, they'd be like the conservative branch of the Democrats, I'd say.
Right.
So this kind of very powerful, big Republican party there's no such thing here.
Yeah, it's I hate our two-party system because like the range of people that there are Democrats that I like and support, and there are Republicans who I tolerate. But then there are people who I'm just like, this is extreme nonsense from both sides, and it's just like, I really wish we had a multi-party kind of parliamentary system where, the idea that like we vote for a representative who like represents my district. It's like the districts are redrawn every like 5 or 10 years or something. The idea that I'm voting for a representative that represents my geographic interests is nonsense. So I'd rather just vote for a party who has like a specific platform, and then they allocate representatives or however it works. I'm not super familiar with the parliamentary system, but like, I would rather have like single issue parties that would focus on an issue, get it passed, and then dissolve and move into some other party or something like that. But yes, we could have a long conversation on the futility of American politics and the nonsense. But
yeah, I think we have a lot of topics. I've got there's a few things I didn't even mention. I was gonna get into Jung and archetypes, but I think that'll extend this forever.
Yes, well, we can. Yes, we and I don't know how much time you've got left. Like I said, I've got some time still, but I would absolutely love to talk again, maybe on more specific stuff and narrow stuff down ahead of time. But yeah, this was great.
Yeah, I'd say it's good point to wrap it up. And I'd be glad to talk about Jung and stuff. I'd say I've devoured, I think, 10 or 11 books by Jung.
Okay, that's Any more than I have, but yes.
I do love to talk about these things. And do you know the channel Meme Analysis?
I feel like I've heard of it. Meme analysis.
Yeah, it's by a guy called Chris Gabriel.
I think I saw someone interview Chris Gabriel. Go ahead,
Yeah.
keep going.
Yeah, it's I love the channel. I think it's kind of crazy a bit. It's a bit out there, but he combines Jung with a lot of occult, strange kind of. He brings in well, Aleister Crowley and Wilhelm
Sure.
Reich, and I I I can't even list them all. He's brought in Nick Land, if you've heard of Nick Land.
Isn't he? No, I'm thinking of Nick Bostrom. Nick Land, I feel like I've heard the name before. What
Nick
is?
Land is very much the deep end of the internet. That's he's like a Deleuzian postmodern
Yeah,
leftist
that
that
sounds
turned
familiar.
hard right at the very end. He turned
Yes,
like
I think yes. I was going to say I feel like right wing is what I want to say.
and
Sigma
yeah,
meme analysis. Yeah,
yeah, he's written the essay called The Dark Enlightenment, and it's like it's very like dark inverted stuff, twist stuff, all about capital and AI and
sure. Well, this is so interesting because memes are archetypes, or at least a good meme is archetypal. And I've always been like I've been writing not a paper, but like I've been trying to tie all of my these disparate ideas under one name, and I like to call it archetypal memetics. Of hey, we live in the modern culture where memes get spread everywhere, but they have archetypal elements to them, and this seems exactly like something on that line. So, and
you know
this is you're like the
you
second
know
person to recommend this, so I'm going to check this out.
You know, it's funny. I have actually handwritten an essay in one of my notebooks called Memetic Archetypes.
Really? There you go. Yeah, yeah. It's yeah. He and my Peterson always talks about when he's asked about like culture and Dawkins and stuff. Like if Dawkins were pursued his thinking to the ends, he would fall into Jung, right? Dawkins' idea of a
Mhm,
meme and then to a
mhm.
Jung, and I'm always super interested to hear more of that.
Yes, I agree, and I
Yeah,
love Dawkins as well. I've read
yes,
the Selfish Gene. I've read the Extended Phenotype. I love
Selfish Gene was
his
great. I got like a third of the way through Extended Phenotype, and I was like, again, I need to like Nietzsche and like Baudrillard. I need to be a little bit smarter and improve my vocabulary before I can go back and read some of these books because I'm just in them. It's like I gotta. Selfish Gene was great though. That was a
yeah,
good
yeah.
review.
No, I like his biological work. As soon as it comes to like this whole atheism debate and stuff, I find him and the other new atheists very superficial. Like I would say like whatever they've said has been whatever case they've made for atheism has been made much more deeper by Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, for
Sure,
example.
sure, sure, sure.
Um,
Yeah. What does Peterson say? He said like the new atheists are like they make arguments like a smart 13-year-old atheist would make against like dogmatic Christians. It's like yes, there's more
yeah,
interesting takes.
they debate a lot of low-hanging fruit in that sense as well. Like I've heard there's this theologian. I liked some of his talks. I don't know much about him. It's David Bentley Hart. I don't know if you've heard of him.
Mm-mm.
And he said in one of his talks that like he's actually glad the new atheists take down uh all of these other theologians that are around because he thinks that these theologians are also terrible.
Oh, sure. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
so he's glad he doesn't have to make the effort, and he's glad the new atheists are around
Oh,
to
good.
take them
Yes.
down. But
Right,
after
right,
that, the
right,
new atheists can't really pull their weight. He said after they're
right.
done with these people, then they kind of that's about as that's about as much as they're good for, according to him.
Yes, yes. I think the Jordan Peterson Sam Harris debates. I don't know if you ever watched those. Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris. They had like 4 2-hour debates. Those to me are to for what it's worth, given my ignorance on everything. Those to me represent the most interesting philosophical questions that are put forward today about like religion and meaning and the necessity for stories and all that. Um, I don't know how many times I've watched those. I've probably watched each of those 5 or 6 times, 4 or 5, maybe. I don't know.
I think I watched some of them, like some of them to the ends, but
Yep.
some of them gave me a headache, I have to say.
The last two with Douglas Murray aren't that interesting. The first two with Brett Weinstein are better. It's more substantive, I'd say. But
because they sometimes go back and forth about what is true, It's just, I feel like they're going
I
in
know.
circles. But
Jordan
it's been
Peterson.
many years. It's been many years
Yes.
that I
It's
watched them when
so
they came out.
it's so interesting. I'm a weird person, I guess. Well, I know I'm a weird person, but I'm weird in a particular way, maybe because when Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris, they had the first podcast they had, they spent like an hour and a half just going over truth. And it was like this weird, almost
Mm,
semantic thing. And they both said a lot of people were unhappy with how we got bogged down in
yeah.
this. And I was like, no, 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 no. That was the most interesting thing because like I want to know exactly what the disagreement is, narrowed it down all the way to the semantics, because that's where I think the meat of the disagreement is.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm always kind of like, no, no, no. Wherever the natural disagreement goes, take it there. Sometimes,
Here,
unless it's just ad hominem bullshit. But
on this question, one book that I liked a lot that you may like is have you heard of Miracles by C.S. Lewis?
uh,
Uh,
I know C.S. Lewis. I've never read any of C.S. Lewis.
so it's a book talking about naturalism versus supernaturalism, and it's this question of whether nature can be kind of self-sufficiently described by itself, or whether you need a transcendent frame within
Yes, to
which you embed
contextualize what nature
nature
is.
to contextualize what nature is. And I find like this whole debate about what is truth, I feel like C.S. Lewis kind of has written it all down
Is already
in a
interesting. Okay,
concise, nice way. But it's also kind of difficult to read because it's
sure,
C.S. Lewis and it's a philosophical kind of work by him.
sure,
But
sure,
it's
sure.
this whole idea of like if all there is nature, then we cannot actually assume that our logic has transcendent validity. We cannot assume that then our theories we have about nature are transcendently valid, because they would have to be derivative of
Something
biopsychological,
non.
yeah,
Yeah. Oh, that's
biopsychological
interesting.
things. So they would have to be fleeting, kind of. They'd have to be drifting on some sort of unstable ground. And
Right.
you can make a case for that and affirm that. And I would say someone like Nietzsche actually did. Nietzsche is basically on this, he affirms the abyss, he affirms the jumping into the void, where it's like our logic is not transcendently valid, but that's okay. I mean, I embrace it.
Yeah. This sounds like I believe it's the what is it called? There's like a Christian apologetics argument called the tag. It's like oh, it's something, it's basically that it's presuppositionalism, where it's like, where if you believe in evolution and you believe our ability to make truth claims evolved and is therefore impartial, right, is not absolute because it's just a tool, right, which is kind of the pragmatist Darwinian claim, then therefore that's logically self-defeating, because your if you believe that our ability to make truth claims is limited, then that claim would be limited too. So like the
Yeah.
theory of evolution caused us to limit our ability to make truth claims. Okay, but how do you know that that's true if you just admitted that you're unable to make truth claims because of evolution? And
Mhm.
the cut through that, I think, is the pragmatist idea, which is like partial truths or truths that are good enough. You know, if I have a flashlight, I can see right in front of me, but I can't see 100 or 1,000 yards all the way in front of me. But like the fact that I can see around me is good enough to basically do what I'm doing. And man, the amount
Mhm.
of I've had debates with like Christian apologists who are the most um, semantically attuned, let's say, to put it charitably, in terms of like, well, you can't say that because that's technically a logical fallacy, because you just, and it's just like, whoa, 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 hold on. Like, yes, it
Right,
gets
right.
interesting. I'll check out C.S. Lewis. Miracles, you said, is it an essay or is it a whole
Miracles.
book or?
It's a book, but as far as I'm concerned, you don't need to read it all. I think there's
Okay.
like a few chapters that convey the
Okay.
whole
Yeah, I'd be
message, and then
curious
it goes into,
if you get a chance to send me some excerpts or which chapters or whatever. I'd be interested in listening to those for sure.
for sure. Yeah. All right. This
Cool.
conversation has been great, Paul. I